Good evening. I'm Rocco Stano, a member of the program committee here at the Princeton Club, and I'm also the director of the Empire State Center for the Book, and I would like to welcome you all here for this evening's presentation. This is one of many that we're doing with the Princeton Club cooperatively with the Center for the Book, and again, I am thrilled that you're all here. Presidential historians, you turn on, MSNBC and these guys pop up, John Meacham pops up and Doris Kearns Goodwin and etc. But there is a new age of presidential historians, and I am happy to welcome one of the new presidential historians, Craig Furman, with us here today, and he's going to be talking about his latest book, which is called The Best Presidential Writings. But before that, his first book is Author in Chief, and welcome all the way from Indiana. Welcome, Craig.
Hey, it's my pleasure to join you all. Thank you so much.
Yes. So, how did you become interested in the presidents?
Well, it actually started with that first book, Author in Chief, and it started all the way back in 2008, believe it or not. So that was obviously a presidential year, a big election, and it wasn't just a year where everybody was following the election. It felt like it was a year where everybody was talking about books, and especially Barack Obama's books. And so I read them. I thought they were great, but I also found myself wondering, had this happened before? It's sometimes political books and political writing get treated a little bit like a joke, but obviously Obama's books weren't a joke. They were essential to his appeal and to his successful campaign. And so I started digging into the history and realizing that, presidential books had always been important, even if they'd been overlooked, and that this history went all the way back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So from there, I started digging into their writings. It took me 10 years to work on Author in Chief, but along the way, I knew that there were so many great texts that people maybe didn't always know that I wanted to do the second book, which is an anthology. You're talking about presidential historians, and they and we, I guess, have an important role. But what I love about the best presidential writing is it's a chance for presidents to tell history themselves. It's all just, some of their most famous speeches, sometimes diaries that people haven't seen before, and it just shows all the important moments in American history, the Civil War, World War II, whatever you can think of. And it's got the presidents offering their own perspective.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about the first book, Author in Chief.
Sure. So that one's a more traditional history, and it starts with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and George Washington a little bit, who wrote more than people gave him credit for. And it sort of traces, how important were these books that presidents wrote. And sometimes that means looking at really important elections, like the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson didn't go out and campaign during that election because that was considered kind of ungentlemanly to do in that time period. But he had written a book, so his book kind of became his proxy, and people would stand up at meetings. I found old newspaper clips that show this. They would stand up at meetings and hold up his book and read from it. And the people who liked Jefferson would point to his book and say, here's why he's great. And the people who disliked Jefferson would point to his book and say, here's why he's terrible. Both sides could find what they wanted to find in that book, which is a truism of politics in any era. But anyway, I sort of trace, big elections, important presidents like Jefferson. There's a great chapter on Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, some surprising presidents like Ronald Reagan and Calvin Coolidge, who were important writers. And I also talk a lot just about the book trade and about book lovers. Because one thing I hope that book does is it tells people who loves books the history of themselves. So I try to answer questions like, if you were alive in Abraham Lincoln's age, what did it feel like to walk into a bookstore? How much did a book cost? What kind of books could you buy? And doing that all the way from their time up to the age of Amazon, I think was an important way to kind of show that presidential books were popular culture. They were so important to the history of America, but also books were important. I mean, Americans have always loved books and cared about books, and I don't think there's a better time to read a book than during an election year.
Yes, and here we are in an election year.
That's right.
So your latest book, the best presidential writings, and here we are. We're actually not at the Princeton Club, but virtually at the Princeton Club. And I think I should tell everybody that you went to, you worked, you did part of your PhD at Yale. Right. And so that's okay. That's okay. Have they invited you?
They have not. Maybe because there's so much Princeton in author in chief. As we were talking and sort of sketching this out, I was like, wow, Princeton comes up in this chapter and in this chapter and in this chapter. So perhaps Yale will never forgive me, but I'm just glad to be here with you all right now.
Yeah. So let's talk about those Princeton connected people in your book. Yes.
Sure. So the first one I wanted to bring up was James Madison, who obviously worked as an undergraduate there. And I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint. I won't do this exclusively, but I do have some images and some text that I thought the best way for everybody to see it would be to put it on your screen. So what I'm going to show you first here is, my book is called Best Presidential Writing. This is not the best anything. This is a poem that James Madison wrote while an undergraduate at Princeton. And the names that you will see in bold and underlined, those are the names of other Princeton undergraduates. So this is very much the product of a college mind who, him as 17, 18, 19-year-old is writing about his friends in poetry. Eckley skin and Jake's together, when tanned will make a sign of leather, just fit to clothe McCorkle's bum, which now becomes a battering ram, and placed before a city wall will ward off many a whizzing ball, and by its monstrous stench may save 10,000 Yanks from the grave. So, even James Madison was a slightly addled college student. It happens to us all. And that's not in my book because that's not the best anything, but for this audience, I thought you all would get a kick out of it. One thing that Madison did do that's the best, though, is his entries from the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And so in this time where there are these debates about the Constitution, several people are taking notes, but the person who took the best notes was James Madison. And so the passages that I include from that in Best Presidential Writing are sort of the debate about the executive. You can see a page here. What does it mean to be president? And that's, I think, just one of the interesting things about presidents in writing is that the presidency itself has always been created, defined, and expanded through writing. Because at the beginning, there were debates, and you can read Madison's view on this in these extracts. There were debates, should we have one president? Should we have 5 presidents, like a board of presidents? Is president even the right name to use for this? And so these were all issues that had to be sorted out. And once they were sorted out in writing in the Constitution, they continued to be refined and defined. And so in many examples throughout American history, when a president wants to do something new, wants to claim a new power or execute a new idea, they do that through speeches and through writing. And so writing isn't just something that presidents do on the side. I think in many ways, writing is the presidency and the way that they enact and enforce the presidency. And for that reason, this book, The Best Presidential Writing, I think kind of tells the story, not just of the presidency, but of America. The great thing is it just tells it in the president's own words.
Right. So another Princetonian who hasn't in recent times has been having his own problems. Woodrow Wilson. Actually, we had a room at the club called the Woodrow Wilson Room. It's no longer called that. And actually, in the last few months, he's come up as a racist. And so, what have you found about Woodrow Wilson?
Sure. Well, let's go back to some more images, like I said, and I can show you some more about this. So this is a picture of Wilson, and I think it's worth just starting, since we're going to talk about his words and how they relate to race. It's worth just remembering how important he was as a writer before he ever ran for president. This is an ad that ran in magazines like The Atlantic and Harper's in the 1890s, and it's for a big multi-volume history he did called A History of the American People. And Wilson got a bigger royalty check from this than any nonfiction writer had ever gotten in American history. This book was everywhere. It really made him a national star. You can see, or maybe you can't because the print's small, but in this ad it just says, President Woodrow Wilson. That doesn't mean president of America. That, of course, means president of Princeton. And that's, at that time, he was this national figure writing this book. just another image that I think is interesting of him as a writer is that he wrote by hand, but he would type his drafts up and edit on typewriter. And so this is a page from his first book, and I think his best book, and it's also excerpted in Best Presidential Writing, called Congressional Government. And so this was a book that you could see that after he wrote the handwritten drafts, he would type it up and then edit some more in his handwriting. And you can see an image there too of the kind of typewriter that Wilson used. One interesting thing about Congressional Government is that it was a book where Wilson sort of talked about how weak the presidency was. He wasn't a president yet, he was a political scientist, but in the 19th century, the presidency was still kind of weak, and it would take presidents like Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt to sort of modernize and expand the power of the presidencies. Once again, how did they do that? They did that through speeches, through writing, and all that stuff, all those themes are touched upon in my book. But in terms of Wilson and race, I actually wanted to talk about that history of the American people. In that, Wilson, we know a lot about Wilson's relationship with Black Americans. He grew up in the South, obviously, and could never shake the prejudices of his region and his era, and made many unfortunate choices as president that fit into that. But that wasn't the only area where Wilson struggled in that regard. In the history of the American people, Wilson described America's immigration like this. There came multitudes of men of the lowest class from the south of Italy, and men of the meaner class out of Hungary and Poland, men out of the ranks where there were neither skill nor energy nor any initiative of quick intelligence. So that's Wilson just writing in his mind matter-of-factly about immigrants from Italy, Hungary, and Poland. And that passage became very controversial when he ran for president a couple decades later. You know, there was opposition research, and so people would dig through his books and find those, and people from those communities didn't like Wilson describing and dismissing them in that way. And one thing that's really interesting to me is the way that Wilson reacted to that. He said, you know, when people would try to attack him on the stump as he was running for president, he would say it's, quote, very unfortunate if I had been so awkward in my way of expressing what I had to say. That's not really an apology, right? That's not, I'm sorry for what I said. It's, I'm sorry for how I said that. But we're also kind of used to this non-apology. Lots of politicians offer this sort of approach. So as I said when I was talking about my first book, books by presidents have been so important to the changing evolution of American history, and this is an example of that. It's also an example of how kind of the responses to it are, you know, exactly and similar to what we experience today. Just another quick example from somebody that I always think of. Sorry, he's a Harvard man, but in relationship to Wilson, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. In one of his books, Teddy did the exact same thing. He used these kind of degrading and dismissive stereotypes about Black soldiers who served under him. He said they were, quote, uneasy. They tended to drift to the rear, quote, they flashed their white teeth at one another as they broke in broad grins. And you can see that language is just very stereotyped and ugly. Once again, when Roosevelt ran for president, this caused him trouble, where Black voters especially didn't enjoy this and reacted against it. And these kinds of contemporary reactions are also an example of what we're always thinking. You know, were people bad by our standards or bad by the standards of their time? Well, with both Wilson and Roosevelt, you can see that people who lived at the same time were criticizing them for this stuff. And once again, Roosevelt responds in a way that feels like it could come out of 2020. He just says that his critics have, quote, attempted to make a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah, you're making me wonder if my grandparents, who are from southern Italy and who were here during the Wilson administration and actually were probably able to vote then, if they actually voted for Wilson. They probably did, but yeah, but very, very interesting.
Sure.
Yes, yeah, and I was surprised that there's a Clinton. Before we go on to Clinton, I just want to mention to everybody two things. One is that in the Q&A box, please ask questions. We'll get to your questions at the end. We're not covering all the presidents. There are so many to cover. So please feel free to ask questions. We'll get to them. And also, if you're interested in purchasing either of the books, we have a link that will be in the chat or Q&A, and it will be available on an email that comes out later for you to buy the book, because it is a great holiday gift for the person that you know is into presidents. Yes, because we're all sort of into presidents, especially this year. But back to Clinton. Clinton, there's a Princeton connection with Clinton.
That's right, and that means back to these PowerPoints here. This is a picture of Clinton at Princeton in 2000. He ended up speaking there. There was a academic conference convened by professors. I think Sean Wilentz was the one who did it, on the progressive tradition. So the progressive tradition, of course, is the kind of politics that you see from Wilson and from Roosevelt, a tradition that led not only to a much expanded presidency, but also important reforms that helped make lives for regular Americans a lot better. And so there was this academic conference, and they asked Clinton to come and speak at it. And Clinton, being a huge reader of history, as so many presidents are, agreed to do that. This is a picture from Clinton's presidential library of the speech he gave. Now, my book, Best Presidential Writing, has the final speech that Clinton gave, but this is a draft, and you can really see how much work Clinton put into it. He reread speeches by Wilson and Roosevelt, and he had a speechwriter working with him kind of on that first draft, but Clinton went back in and added more, made some changes, really keyed in on the moments from Roosevelt and Wilson's presidencies that he wanted to talk about, and you can see that he really worked hard on it. But one comment kind of made me chuckle as I was looking back through it, getting ready for this. This was one of Roosevelt's speeches. It's called The New Nationalism. It's a speech he gave in 1910. To me, it's probably the best speech an American president has ever given. But, it's a speech where Roosevelt really makes the case for why America needs to be more progressive, why it needs to push back against big business, why the important thing to do is to take care of the working class and regular Americans, and that if we do that, then everybody will thrive together. So it's a very fiery speech, as you would expect from Teddy Roosevelt. And as Bill Clinton was reading that speech, we can see from his documents that he made a note in the margin. It says, bipartisan is the way to do things. And I don't know about you, but bipartisan is not what I would think of when I think of Teddy Roosevelt, and especially the Teddy Roosevelt of that era with the new nationalism. But it's a great example, not just of a president at Princeton, but how presidents use history. That's a theme I saw again and again. This book sort of feels like a conversation because you have a president like Clinton citing Wilson and Roosevelt. And, the speeches from Wilson and Roosevelt are in the book, and then you can read Clinton's take on them. And really, you're reading Clinton's spin on them because Clinton interprets Roosevelt as sort of being a Bill Clinton kind of new Democrat. Whether that's accurate or not, that's the kind of thing you can solve yourself by reading the books, or reading the text. But it's really fascinating to see them talk back and forth, through the pages of history, which is something American presidents have always done.
Right. And, the Center for the Book, we do many different activities. One is the New York State Writers Hall of Fame, and we also work with United for Libraries in doing literary landmarks. And one of the literary landmarks we did, I guess maybe about 2 years ago, was for President Grant up north of Saratoga. It was Grant's Cottage, and it was where President Grant went. He was very ill at the time, to finish his memoirs. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when we were doing the research for the literary landmark, that President Grant he kind of began this tradition that goes right up to President Obama in writing their memoirs right after they complete their office, and there's a lot more to why Grant wrote his memoirs, and you're going to share all of that with us.
Sure. Yeah, Grant wasn't the first person to do it. But what he was one of the first to publish it in his own lifetime. Remember how I mentioned that Thomas Jefferson couldn't really go out and campaign because that was seen as arrogant. He was putting too much attention on himself, and the last thing a president would want is to have attention on themselves. Now, that seems pretty quaint today, but I promise you that in the 18th and 19th century, that was how most politicians and most voters saw the presidency. That was something that changed over time, and that's one of the changes I talk a lot about in my first book. But for the same reason, a president wouldn't publish their autobiography because, once again, it would be seen as taking credit, wanting the spotlight. And that's not something a president should do even after their death. So instead, what presidents would do is leave their autobiographies. And this is what John Adams did for their children to find and publish. What changed all that was the Civil War. The Civil War was such a massive event, and Americans were so hungry to understand and process it, that for the first time, dozens of politicians and generals started publishing their books as soon as the Civil War was over. And their, presidents were a little cautious. Readers would be like, is it really normal for Sherman to come out and tell his story as a soldier? Is this as brave as anything as he did on his march to Georgia? That's an actual line from a review at the time. But people got used to it, and people loved these books, and there isn't a single book they loved more than Grant's. Let me show you another picture here. So this is the cottage that Rocco was talking about, and this is Grant sitting on that porch. He's very close to his death at this point. Two things caused Grant to become a writer. He went into bankruptcy from some bad investments, and then after that, he developed a terrible form of throat cancer that killed him pretty quickly. So he had a deadline, and he had a real financial need. This was his only chance to sort of make a statement about his legacy, and it was his only chance to provide for his wife and children after he was gone. And so he poured himself into his book, and it's a wonderful book. Most people consider it the best book that a president's ever written. So of course I have a long excerpt from it in the best presidential writing. Grant gave it everything he had. He started out writing. When he got too tired from the cancer to write, he began dictating to a stenographer. It was throat cancer. So of course, after a while, it became too hard for him to speak. So he whispered to the stenographer. Once he couldn't even do that, he went back to writing much more slowly. And this is that final stage where you can see, believe it or not, in this picture, it's June. So it's warm, it's in the 80s, but he's wrapped up in all these layers because he's so cold. His body is just kind of shutting down. But he finished his book. He finished it 2 days before he died. And he really poured everything that he had into it. So one thing I love about Grant's story is that it's a great example that when you see a president write, you can really see the human side of them. And I think that's true in both of the books I've worked on. Honestly, it's true of our everyday lives. If you write somebody an email or even a comment on Facebook or something like that, the act of writing causes you to sort of stop and think, well, what am I really trying to say? What do I really mean? What am I willing to put out into public? What am I not willing to put out into public? There's something about that act of writing that's very personal and very revealing. So when we either kind of look for the behind the scenes stories of how presidents worked as writers, which is what I did in my first book, or look at the finished products that they produced as writers, which is what this anthology, the second book, is all about, we can really see the human side of them. This is a draft from when Grant was first starting out as a writer. Remember, he didn't really want to write a book, but he had to for reasons of health and finances. And you can see that he's not very confident. He's crossing out a lot of lines. You can see sort of the handwriting is cramped, and he's revising. He's tentative. He's not sure. By the end, even in his weakened physical state, he was writing quickly and confidently with no crossouts because he sort of learned to become a better writer, and he learned to tell the story that he needed to tell. And the story he ended up telling is just a remarkable one.
Right. And there's kind of an interesting thing about it being published. There was like a very famous person that was involved in the publication of his memoirs.
Right. It's Mark Twain. And honestly, Mark Twain often gets too much credit for this. Even Harry Truman, I remember working at the Truman Libraries, and in letters, Harry Truman would be like, I always heard that Mark Twain wrote Grant's book for him. And trust me, I've studied the handwritten drafts. There's absolutely no basis for that. Grant had figured out the writing by the time he and Twain worked together. Twain was sort of sneaky. He knew this was going to be a big bestseller, so he sort of ingratiated himself, and it became a big bestseller in part because Twain was such a good promoter. It was a great partnership, but it was more a partnership in the selling of the book than in the writing of the book. But I try to tell that story too in the book. Twain prepared a sort of document for door-to-door salesmen because that's how books were often sold in the 19th century. So Grant's death was such a big story in the news. Newspapers across the country every day would have an update like, Grant goes out for a walk today. Grant wrote 3 pages today. Grant went to his doctor again today and he's getting worse. So this was just a story that almost like, somebody going to the moon or Lindbergh crossing the ocean or something like that. It was something that Americans were following in real time. So Twain wrote this script that the door-to-door salesmen, and many of them were Union veterans, would take. And they would knock on people's doors all across the country. And when the door opened, they would say, I'm here to tell you about the Grant book that you've read so much about in the newspapers. That's how important this book was to the national conversation. And it became easily the biggest seller in American history to that point. the amount of money that Grant made for his family posthumously was, if we adjust it to our financial terms, more than $10 million. And it was also just a wonderful book. It's still in print, and it's still one of the best ways to understand the Civil War and the battles that Grant fought.
Yes, it's still in print, and he actually did write it to provide money for his wife and family after he passed away. Yes, so it is a really very interesting story, and if people have the opportunity to visit Grant's Cottage in north of Saratoga, you really should, because it's very interesting. It's a very interesting place.
As he was sitting on that porch finishing the book, there would just be lines of people who would walk by who just wanted to see this great president, this great general one last time. And they respected him. They were quiet so he could keep working, because the whole country wanted him to finish his book. But they would just sort of file by, and then he would receive visitors. Twain visited him there on that porch. So I totally agree. It's a special book, and it's a special place that people should check out.
Right. And, Grant's tomb in New York City, too, was like the most visited site for the longest time, because of Civil War veterans would, make a pilgrimage to Grant's tomb. And, we New Yorkers kind of take it for granted because we just pass by it all the time. But, so if you're up on the Upper West Side, I suggest, especially this time when people are looking for things to do, especially in the fall, and it is a nice place to visit. And I'm sure the Park Service people are there that will give you a little history about the site. Yes.
Totally agree.
Yes. So in writing this, did you find any surprises? Like who would have thought so-and-so was such a great writer?
Sure. The most surprising writer for me was Calvin Coolidge, who isn't, traditionally seen as a very verbal president. If anything, it's the opposite. What he's famous for is being a man of few words, but that was not his reputation at the time. And I went to the Coolidge Presidential Library, looked at his letters, looked at the media reception to him in his era, and people thought he was a wonderful writer. And I think his best book is his autobiography. He had another book that really helped him become president, and that's A Story I Tell an Author-in-Chief, and I include one of the speeches in this best presidential writing. But my favorite Coolidge thing, and don't tell the Grant fans, but I think probably one of the best things to read by a president is Coolidge's autobiography, which is no longer in print, but thankfully we were able to get the rights to include the most important excerpt of it in this anthology. And it's a short book, it's about a sixth as long as Grant's book. And it's a very personal book. What Coolidge does is he doesn't really litigate, the political debates. We wanted this, they wanted that. It's just, what did it feel like to be president? And Coolidge had a better and more moving story to tell in that regard than most presidents, because his son died while he was in the White House. And it's one of the most remarkable things an American president ever wrote. His account of being president, being the most powerful person in the world, and watching his son die. And despite that power, despite that position, there was nothing he could do to stop that. In that moment, he wasn't president, he was a father. And like so many other fathers, he just had to, sort of accept fate and grieve fate, although the entire nation grieved with him. So Coolidge, who again is just a fantastic writer, he's somebody who grew up studying Benjamin Franklin, and they both have that kind of salty New England writing style with lots of punchy aphorisms. Coolidge's book really captures what it felt like to be president for him and what it felt like to lose his son, and that's the excerpt that we include. I will also say, though, that what I tried to do is I tried to capture the surprising side of a lot of presidents, because they all have sides that you might not expect. Dwight Eisenhower is another example. In the best presidential writing, I include his famous speeches, like he has a famous farewell address where he talks about the military-industrial complex, right? That's one of the most important speeches in American history, kind of a direct echo of George Washington's farewell address, two general presidents sort of using their gravitas to tell the country what it needs to do next. But Eisenhower also wrote this really fascinating essay that's never been published before. I found it when I was at the Eisenhower Library doing research a few years ago, and it's Eisenhower sort of reflecting on, what does a good autobiography do? Eisenhower wrote his presidential memoirs, of course, like so many others. But in this essay, he really talks about Grant a lot. And so he goes back and he rereads Grant's memoirs, sort of says, you know, this is what we learned about Grant as a general from his book, and this is what we could learn as a writer from what Grant's book does as well. So it shows you that Eisenhower, despite, you know, the idea that he's kind of this sort of old, detached president, which isn't a fair image anyway, but he was also very literary. He was very engaged with books, and he was somebody who cared a lot about history. So that's just one example, but there's, you know, 10 or 15 examples. There's 93 texts in this book, and a lot of them are those sort of, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the big ones. But a lot of them are also these sort of surprising sides where you see, you know, a president who has a life or a background or a hobby or an interest that you might not expect. And I love that stuff. I love seeing the human side of them.
Yes, you know, and we just had they just opened the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, which took a while, and it was very controversial. But you know, so it, you know, having you here, you know, this evening kind of gives us the opportunity to reflect on the presidency and the many men who have been president and how they have all been very different and how they kind of left a piece of themselves through their writing. So you kind of were able to touch upon these individuals, you know?
Sure.
Yeah, and now we're like here right now in the presidential election, and you know we have President Trump and Biden. Have you? I know President Trump is represented in your book.
That's right. That's right. I have an excerpt from Art of the Deal, which I think is I picked it because although he wasn't president at that point, obviously, he talks a lot about Reagan and Carter, and so I think first of all it's interesting. Always interesting to read one president talking about another president, whether it's Eisenhower talking about Grant or Trump talking about Reagan or Carter. But the other reason I picked Art of the Deal is because it's really what made him president. It's what made him a national figure. It's, you know, before he had the Twitter feed, before he was a reality TV star, the book is what changed him from being a New York celebrity and a New York developer to being a national figure. And I talk about this a little bit in Author in Chief, but, you know, book publishing was changing in the 1980s, and it was really focused on celebrity books and books with big figures on the front. Lee Iacocca's book had just come out. And so at that point, editors were like, well, we need business people. Business books sell. Let's find the next ones. So Trump was one of the people that they approached. And I actually interviewed the editor of this book. And you want to talk about a mind-blowing irony of history. The same editor who acquired Trump's book was the editor who decades later acquired Barack Obama's first book. Same guy responsible for both of their first books. History will always surprise you. But anyway, this editor knew that he had to sell Trump on this book. So what he did, he told me, was he got a big Russian novel from his office, you know, a book that was big and stately, had the production department wrap it in this shiny black paper, and then put in giant letters on the front, Trump, in gold lettering. And that was the sales pitch. That was, you know, this is what we can make your book look like. Trump loved it. He worked carefully with a ghostwriter who did a good job, although Trump was involved as well. And I really think Art of the Deal, if you reread it, or even if you just reread a couple excerpts of it, you'll see that his political philosophy and his ideas about how to work the media, they were all there in that book. And that book and all the interviews he got to do, because it was such a huge bestseller, that book was what made him a national figure long before Twitter or the TV show. On Biden, I would highly recommend, I didn't include it in the book because Biden's not an American president, at least not yet. We'll see how it goes. But he has a book that came out recently. It's a slim book called Promise Me Dad. And I think it's a remarkable political memoir. It's actually a lot like Coolidge's that I was talking about, in that it's very short and it's very personal. There's not a lot about being vice president. What it's mostly about is losing your son, Beau Biden in this case. And it's a book that tells you a lot about Biden and a lot about why people like him. But it's also interesting to think about it in terms of Obama's book, because Obama's Dreams from My Fathers was kind of famously not a political book, right? He wrote it before he had any ideas of running for office. And it's a very literary book, you know, lots of descriptions, lots of scenery, feels almost like a novel. And Biden's book is the same way. I don't think Biden is quite as much of a reader of literature as Obama is, although Biden certainly has favorite authors too. But I think that Biden's book, Pete Buttigieg's book, another person who ran for office, you can see in these new wave of presidential aspirant books how much Obama's book influenced them. They all feel like they're trying to be the next Dreams from my father.
Right. Yes. Well. Thank you. So did you visit many of the presidential libraries on your research for this?
Yeah, I mean, more than a dozen. I don't know if I ever counted them up, but Author in Chief has 13 chapters, and it's they're mostly. I didn't cover every president because, frankly, I don't think the book would have been as gripping to read. And I really wanted to tell the story of the books that made a difference, the books that had really mattered and been at the center of American history. But yeah, I visited more than a dozen archives, some presidential libraries. I spent a lot of time at the Kennedy Presidential Library and found some documents in his handwriting that nobody had seen before. Spent some time at a small archive in Boston that had Ronald Reagan's letters that people had never seen before. And so it helped to have this very narrow focus, right? Like, you think presidents plus books, that might hurt you as a writer because it's narrow, but I think it's the opposite. When you have a specific question to ask, that allows you to really dig deeper and find things other people have missed. And then I believe that this angle of presidents and their books, that's when we see them at their most human. And that's when we also see these books really making a huge difference in American history. So I was thankful to have a focused topic, because that let me find lots of new stuff that you won't find in any other books.
Right. Well, yeah, you gave us a great insight on the presidency and the men who were president. And so now let's open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A here. And I will start with a first question, which is my question, because I'm the host, so I get to ask the first.
Works the job. Fair.
Yes. So one of the things that the Empire State Center for the Book, one of our programs is the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. And in recent years, we inducted just last year, we inducted Doris Kearns Goodwin. We inducted Ron Chernow. The same year we inducted Hamilton, and then one of our very first inductees was Robert Caro, and they were all presidential historians. They may have just focused on one or two presidents, but they were presidential historians. Do you have a favorite among them?
Well, you're making it hard for me because you've named three of the greats, right? They all have done really important work and written books that will long outlive them and shape how we understand American history for a long time to come. But I would say of those three, Caro is probably my favorite because of his style. I think he's a very stylish writer, and it's not just that he's dug up a lot of new facts, which of course his research is compendious as well, but it's that even if 10 other writers had the same set of facts, nobody would tell the story the way that he does. And so he would be my choice. And I'm also I have a little bit of a personal interest in this because we're all waiting on Caro's last volume, right? And in that volume, I assume he'll spend at least a few pages talking about Lyndon Johnson writing his presidential memoirs. So I did some of that work myself too. I wish I could have just pulled down that volume of Caro and relied on that to guide me, but it hasn't been published yet. But I did interview some of Johnson's ghostwriters, and it's a fascinating behind-the-scenes story. So I'm really interested to see what Caro will do with it. But it's also a great example of how sometimes presidential books can let you down a little bit. Because Johnson's dictations, what I did with this, The Best Presidential Writing, is that I didn't include Johnson's book. I included the raw dictations before the book. Because Johnson sat down with his ghostwriters and he would talk through, they would ask him questions about Kennedy's assassination. That's actually the episode I include in this. And they would sort of talk through this. The final book version is not as revealing as the raw dictations because Johnson really asked them to take out some stuff. Probably the best thing for me to do here is just give you an example.
Yeah, please.
So this is in Dallas, the day before the assassination. So Johnson is always talking about how Kennedy is in his underwear. He'll ask, that's not in the final book, but in the raw dictations before it gets kind of sanitized, that's in there. So Johnson and his sister are coming up to meet with to meet with Kennedy in Fort Worth, actually. Or no, I'm sorry, the sister lived in Fort Worth. So this is Johnson talking to his ghostwriters, and we have the transcripts preserved at the Johnson Presidential Library. Kennedy was once again in his shorts. He called me to come in. He was putting on his shirt, walking around and talking. He put his arms in his shirt. That was the way he always dressed. He would put on his shorts and then put on his shirt. I would always dress the other way, put on my shorts, then put on my trousers. I had been raised to cover up that part of me first. I told my sister to wait in the hall. Kennedy said, "How did you like that line about us not taking any time to get ready?" He was looking for a compliment or a laugh about his little witticism. Presidents always look for that kind of thing, and people always give it to them. So, needless to say, none of that material makes it in Johnson's final book. I mean, I think he mentions that he and his sister see Kennedy, but Kennedy in his underwear, Kennedy's kind of need for affection, Johnson's kind of willingness to give him the affection, all those great behind-the-scenes details, they're not in the final book. So that's why for my book, I wanted that kind of raw and personal side, even though it hadn't been printed before. So that's an example of how interesting Johnson is behind the scenes. And so Cairo has a great subject, and I'm really interested to read all of his last volume, but especially how he talks about Johnson with the book, because maybe people already know this, but Doris Kearns Goodwin was one of his ghostwriters too. She was obviously much younger back then, and she was one of the people who came in and tried to help Johnson tell the full story until Johnson would keep saying, cut out the good parts, I want to seem like a president, and he ended up with a pretty dull book because of it.
Right. And Caro has made his career. How many volumes is
I think he's 4 are done, and the 5th is coming hopefully soon.
Right. Hopefully. Right. Yes. So if you were to, and maybe you are thinking about this, if you were to write a presidential biography, who would you pick?
I think I am starting to think about what I'll write for my next book. And as I've been tossing around different ideas, I think what I would like to pick, whichever one I end up choosing, is not just picking the right president, but the right event or the right time frame. Because like I said earlier, one thing that helped me find so much new stuff was that I had a specific question. And so if I were going to write about, a specific president, it might be that president and 1 year of their presidency, or one election, or one campaign, or one bill even. I really think that books that go very narrow like that, first of all, they can be page-turning books. And I tried really hard in Author-in-Chief to make it a fun book to read. And the reviews that kept saying it's entertaining, that was my favorite thing to see, because I don't think books need to be boring. Books should be enjoyable. That's one of the things we love about our favorite books. But finding something kind of specific, I think would be the way to do it. And so a lot of my favorite books about presidents aren't just one president, they're one president plus something specific. So I haven't found the right version of that equation yet, and I might not on this book. It might be something I have to think on and write a different book next. But for me, it's not just necessarily the president, it's that extra thing that allows you to tell a compact story, even though of course that story will open up to talk about their life and their themes and their beliefs more broadly. Right. Now we have a question from Britt Berkeley here, and it says, did your research include in your book any writings between presidents and other world leaders, like letters, telegrams, etc., with an eye for ulterior motives or clear motives? Thinking of letters between like Roosevelt and Churchill as an example, and the latter requesting aid during World War II. Sure. No, that's a really good question. I tried to keep the story mostly focused on American politics, because I was having to start with Jefferson and Adams and go all the way up forward. But there is certainly, you can't tell that story without having international influences as well. So Truman's memoirs, for instance, Harry Truman, one of my favorite presidents, both as a writer and as a president, his memoirs, I honestly think, Lyndon Johnson's memoirs kind of suffered a little bit because he wasn't willing to put himself in there. Truman's memoirs suffered a little bit for another reason, which is that he was trying to put too much stuff in there. Truman himself loved history, and so I think he assumed that everyone else loved history as much as him. So if you read Truman's memoirs, which are 2 volumes, a total of more than 1,000 pages. In there, he includes cables between Truman and Churchill, and they go on for like 6 pages. And so, as a historian, for me, I would read those 6 pages, and then I would say, here are the 3 most telling quotes, and I'm going to summarize the rest to try to keep the story moving, to try to keep the story interesting. Truman didn't want to do things that way. He loved history, and he assumed that other people would really love seeing those documents. And to be fair, a lot of them did. Truman's memoirs were a huge bestseller, and to see those kinds of things that the questioner was asking about, those kinds of, to be able to look for those motives themselves, that was pretty special. When it came time to the best presidential writing, though, what I did again was pick and choose. So when I decided to include some of Truman's memoirs, which again I think are very underrated as a book, I included the passages where he sort of finds out that FDR has passed and that he will become president, and that he finds out about the atomic bomb. All that happens just in the span of a couple hours. It's really intense, and Truman does a great job describing it. And then I also just included some passages where Truman talks about how much he loved history and how much his high school history teacher meant to him. Because I think that, that's in some ways where future presidents are made, where they start to learn about history, where they learn that history matters, where they learn that people who love the country can do something to help and change the country. And so Truman talks wonderfully about his own childhood and about the teachers who sort of helped put him on that path.
Right. Thank you. Scott Silverman asks, has any president before Trump ever taken a position as to his own legacy? For example, Trump says he is the greatest president in history.
Yes, pretty much all of them. Now, they might not do it in public for the reasons that we talk about, but go back to John Adams. He's writing on his autobiography, and he actually stopped working on his autobiography because he was just too frustrated about how he thought history would perceive him. And Adams wrote this really honest letter that I really like, where somebody says, you should really write your autobiography. Americans are going to want to know what the presidency and what history was like for you. And Adams, at this point, had given up. He'd written more than 400 pages, but he got tired of just constantly confronting the fact that, Trump might think that he's the greatest, but Adams, with a harsh look, was able to realize that he was not the greatest, and that certainly other people didn't think he was the greatest. And so Adams said to this person who was asking, why don't you write your autobiography? Adams said, I've tried before, but every time I write about my life in politics, I look so much like a little boy that in my own vanity, I can't stand it, and so I give up. That's probably the most honest thing that John Adams ever wrote. But that's something that lots of presidents have grappled with. What are Grant's memoirs, if not his attempt to sort of put himself to ensure and shore up his legacy? You've got the Grant tomb, but you've also got the Grant books, which are a kind of literary tomb that he hoped would sort of keep his reputation going. Now, there aren't many examples of presidents, at least in public, coming out and saying it as let's say boldly as Trump did, but in private they all thought that way. Another good example is John F. Kennedy. A reporter one time said, why do you love reading about great public figures, great heroes of history? And Kennedy just said back very deadpan and very seriously, well, if you're an engineer, you like to read about engineers. So, unpack the logic of that. Kennedy's like, well, I'm going to be a great history hero, so why wouldn't I like to read about other great heroes of history? Duh, of course. If you're an engineer, you like that. If you're a cook, you like that. If you're a great man, you like to read about great men. That's that kind of mindset is often there. It's just perhaps not as publicized as our current president might do it.
Right. But if you were to have to pick one president that you would say is the most similar to our current president, who would it be?
Well, it's hard to answer that question without taking a political stand.
Okay.
But I would compare him to James Buchanan, because James Buchanan, and this is in terms of the last year and the virus. Let's table the rest of it. Let's just say that Buchanan was a president with a giant national calamity approaching, this being the Civil War. And Buchanan actually, I remember I mentioned the Civil War kind of changed how people write and made presidents comfortable with not writing something for the future the way Adams did, but writing in real time. So James Buchanan wrote a book and published it. And that book just constantly shifts the blame. Every page in that book, it blames another person for the Civil War. Oh, it's the reporter's fault. Oh, it's the abolitionist's fault. Oh, it's my political opponent's fault. it just constantly shifts the blame instead of confronting the problem and asking whether Buchanan might have done anything differently. That reminds me, with the virus, at least, of what we're seeing from the current administration.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. That's because I would not know that about Buchanan, and that's very interesting.
The book was a huge flop. It's the first reviews were kind of shocked. They were like, "Wait, a president's publishing his own book?" They couldn't even believe it. Which of course is funny to think about today when we all know that presidents are going to publish their books. But the reviews were also very, very harsh. And after a couple of weeks, Buchanan asked his friends, just please don't send me any more reviews. I'm done with this. Just don't forward them. I don't want to see them.
Right, yes. So we have a question. We know that you can get a copy of the book by the link, which is at the Center for the Books bookshop, which actually supports local bookstores, and we get a small percentage of that. But someone said, can they get a signed copy, and do you ship internationally? So I know there's some local bookstores that may have signed copies.
Right. I would, first of all, thank you for your interest. That's very kind of you. I will put my email address in the Q&A, if I can do that. Let's see here.
You can do that, yes.
All right. So do I just answer live or click type answer?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
Craig, you can type it in the chat. Everybody will see it.
Okay, perfect. Not Q&A, chat. I knew something didn't feel right. Okay, so I'm putting in my personal email here. You can also find it by just Googling my name, and it'll be on my website. Send me an email and I'll see what I can do. Sometimes I'll sign book plates for people and mail them to them, although I know if you're a book lover, that's not quite the same thing. But send me an email, and if you're interested in a copy of either book, I have some copies. Happy to sign them. International shipping might be tricky, but we'll figure out what we can figure out. So just shoot me an email, and I'm a book lover myself, so I understand loving books and loving signed books. So just shoot me an email, and I'll do what I can to help out. There's one period there, right? Craig.
Right. And I can see that you're a book lover from your background there.
That's right. Some of these are my wife's. It's a bookish family. My kids' books are all over the floor, right? Like there's picture books. You can't walk without falling and breaking something. But yeah, a lot of those are my wife's books as well.
Right. Yeah. Well,
we're both bookish.
Yeah. Now, here's another. Speaking of books, Scott Silverman, which book do you think influenced a president the most? Perhaps Sinclair's The Jungle?
Right. So this is a question about presidents as readers, which is something I talk about a lot in the book, and I think it's really important. And you can see so many examples. A young Ronald Reagan read Coolidge's autobiography, for instance, and he would quote a line from it even in the White House, let's see, like 70 years later and 60 years later. And what's always interesting to me is that even though Coolidge's son died, Reagan would quote one of the happy lines from the beginning of that story and not the sort of sad part at the end. And I just think that shows you how Reagan saw the world, that kind of optimism, that sort of looking for the moments to bring people together or to make people smile. That's what stuck with Reagan. And that tells you something about how he was as a reader. And he was a very passionate reader as well. I think Sinclair's book is a really good example. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was such a big reader. Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives was another book that really shaped Roosevelt as a reader. There was a book that really influenced Kennedy's approach to poverty. I'm blanking on the name of it. It was a New Yorker article at first, but then it was a best-selling book, and Kennedy's assassination prevented him from being able to finish that. But it was, that was important to him as well. It would be hard to pick one, but you can, I would say the president who was most influenced by books as a category would be Lincoln. One of the things I included in Best Presidential Writing was a lecture that Lincoln gave before he ran for the White House. It's kind of a dry topic. It's about inventions and technology and sort of how the human race has improved and changed. And so Lincoln kind of surveys everything. He starts out with, iron tools and goes all the way up to the telegraph. But the one technology that Lincoln gets the most passionate about, and you can just feel the writing change in the excerpt that I choose, is printing. Because Lincoln talks about how much printing could change the world. And the verb he uses is he says, printing could emancipate the mind. Now, that's, of course, not a verb you would use in the 1850s unless you felt very strongly about it, because emancipation was, the most important metaphor on either side of that issue that one could use. But I think that just shows how much Lincoln cared about books. And I think that's because books did that for him. He didn't have many books when he was growing up. We can't point to one book for him the way we could with Roosevelt and Sinclair's book. But books as a category helped Lincoln, living on the frontier, understand that there was a bigger world and bigger ideas that he could fight for. And books pushed him on that journey that helped him go all the way to the White House.
Right.
Great question.
Yes, well, thank you. And I just want to make sure that we answered all the questions here. I think we did. Yes. And so thank you so much for being here tonight. And it was extremely interesting. The book is being released when? It's soon.
It's a week from today. My author-in-chief came out in February. And so that's available already, but this one comes out a week from today. You can pre-order it on Bookshop or Amazon or other retailers, and it'll get to you soon.
So author-in-chief came out in February of 2020?
That's right.
Oh,
right before all this madness hit.
So 2 books in 1 year. Lucky you, yes.
Well, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it as 2 books after 10 years, right? Because remember, I started working on this back when Obama was running, and so these have both been labors of love for a long time, and I've worked really hard on them. So I'm lucky that they're coming out in 1 year, but it's a lot more than 1 year's worth of work in them.
Yes, well, it was a pleasure having you. And I just want to, before we leave, I just want to let people know that in the next few weeks, we're going to be meeting again with some other people. And one is Cobble Hill, which is for all you people that know people in Brooklyn. You have to tell them to check out Cobble Hill, and it is by the creator Cecily von. Okay, I will learn to pronounce her last name by that night, von Ziegenzer, and that's on November 5th. But she's the person who created the Gossip Girls, so she has a whole little industry there with the Gossip Girls, and so this book is sort of the Gossip Girls grow up, and they all live in Brooklyn, of course. Yes, and then on November 19th, we have Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway. It actually talks about the musicals of the 1990s with Michael Riedel, who is the theater critic of the New York Post. So, yeah. Look for those in your club updates. So, Craig, again, thank you so much. And remember, you can order the books from a bookshop. And who knows who the next president will be in the best presidential writings.
Well, we might have to make a change for the paperback. We'll find out in a couple weeks, right? But in the meantime, you can read about what previous presidents have said, and it's a nice way to take a longer perspective on America, and it's good and it's bad.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming.
Great. Thank you.